The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Well, let me just start by saying that I'm a music major here at MIT in addition to computer science. In music, I've been particularly attracted to early music, pre-Baroque, things like the Renaissance and before that. And one of the things that we focused on in Mike Cuthbert's early music class, 21M.542, was music notation and how that's transformed over the ages from about the 9th century up to right at the beginning of the Baroque when we start to see modern notation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the history and the movement of, or I guess the transformation of music notation and kind of how it relates to time. And then at the end I plan to kind of relate that to Mike Cuthbert's assertion that music is slowing down, as he says. So with that, this is sort of what we're used to seeing when people think of music, especially those outside of, you know, the sort of very specific field of music itself. You know, if you think music, you're thinking something that looks like this. And then in regards to time, with tempo, you're looking at, you know, either Italian words or some, you know, French or German or even English depictions of how fast or how slow or how a particular piece should be played. Or even more recently, you might see things like tempo markings in, you know, beats per minute or something like that. And that gives you opportunities to transform pieces in ways that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to. You know, in this case, both of these lines will be performed identically if played as written. But music hasn't always been like this. In fact, it's gone through a number of different transformations over the years, from very early in music notational history. And I should also shut off my chat client. So from very early to the more recent, music has been transformed, innovated upon in various ways. And so I'm just going to kind of do kind of a brief overview and kind of a survey of these different stages, I suppose. So the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of early notation. Staffless, it's a funny word called neumes. And what they are is these figures, these sort of lines and dots and sort of notation to represent music in a way that was done from about the 9th century up to, I want to say 10th, 11th century is when it started to fade out. This one in particular is known as an unheightened neume. So these are all actually on the same line. And what these neumes represent is more or less the general motion of the notes that are associated with the syllables that they appear above. So in this case, you might see an upward moving neume, and that would mean that the notes, the melody would ascend in that section. It's particularly difficult to decipher much of this because they are on the same level with the ones next to each other. It's very difficult to tell the actual shape of that melody. You don't actually know whether it'll continue going up or whether it, you know, comes back down and goes up again. And of course, there's no real indication of tempo or speed or how this should be performed. It's kind of been a transition to today's time where there's more and more commentary and performance notes being included in musical scores. And back then, there really wasn't much at all. And it was sort of it was more of an oral tradition, I'd say. So then comes one of the first major innovations that you can see here. You'll notice now that these neumes still look somewhat similarly, but you might notice that they are actually, they kind of move with the notes. Some are higher above the words than others. And this is was pioneered by the Beneventon Abbey, and is known as heightened neumes. So in this case, you can actually begin to construct a sort of melodic movement by seeing that, okay, so here we have something going up, and then we have a neume that kind of zigzags down a bit, but it keeps going lower. So you can kind of go that way too and construct a melody out of that. So in addition, out of this is you start to get this relationship between individual pitches. And also there was some early notation of duration as well. They would write either, there might be a small stylized letter T for tenare, which is to hold out a note for longer, and other things like that that begin to give people in today's time that are researching this an idea of what such a performance is like. However, it's still, you still don't get an idea of what's sort of the standard. You know, if you're supposed to hold out this note, how long you're supposed to hold it out. You know, there's just a lot of speculation there, and there isn't really a lot of absolute knowledge. The next stage that we get to is what's known as square notation, from about the 12th century onwards. These are still considered neumes, but they take on a much more defined shape. You see the beginnings of a staff system appear as well. And so you end up being able to tell what the pitches actually are. So you might have early indications of a clef. So you know, this would tell you this is a C clef, which will tell you where the note middle C is. And then from there you can work out where the other pitches are. There still, however, isn't any indication of an absolute tempo or absolute speed. This is where you start to see dots in notes that'll extend some pitches longer than others, but still there isn't really, you know, any good indication of tempo. The Liber Usualis is probably the most well-known example of this. It's still in print today. You can actually get it still in square notation. It's 1,900 pages long, and it comes with a nice introduction that tells you how to read all this and decipher that.
You need to make clear that the Liber Usualis was constructed around 1900, in the 1880s
right.
and 1890s, by groups of modern monks or scribes working in abbeys in France, particularly at Sadoain, where they went to the chant manuscripts and tried to systematize it into this four-line staff notation based on something that's very similar to that in the manuscripts of the later Middle Ages. And those manuscripts, we should mention, continue to be copied over and over again and redone all through the Renaissance into the modern era. So they had many different layers of sources, and they were trying to create a book of common usage for chant singing. That's what Liber Usualis.
Yeah, and it pretty much covers just about every, it's offices and chants for just about any occasion of the...
What that means is that from that point on, for our purposes, chant notation was frozen. Because now you go to the Liber Usualis, whereas before you had all these different versions of chants to look at, and other books were done in the same way.
Right. Things got a bit more complicated later on. Towards the 14th and 15th century, you see well, before that was what's known as the ars nova, which is basically the new art, and the ars subtilior after that, the subtle art. You start to see more interesting subdivisions of what was previously considered the basic note. Mike Cuthbert at the first performance, at the first forum, was talking about the breve, which I think now today it's the same as a double whole note, something like that. So then this is where the breve started to get subdivided into things called minims. And you start to see these appear in some of this music here. They're sort of these diamond-shaped things, these diamond-shaped notes. And then what the subtilior did on top of the ars nova is subdivided that even further and also introduced different proportions of these minims. So instead of just splitting the breve into maybe three different into sets of three or sets of two, you might have something that was 3/2 of a minim or 9/4 of a minim. And what that introduced was an interesting exploration of polymeter, where, similar to what we were exploring at the last concert, you might have two completely different rhythmic patterns on top of each other. Sort of analogous to having two separate time signatures running at the same time. You know, the 3/4 and the 4/4 in the Mozart's oboe concerto or oboe quartet was one example of that. This is actually pulled from the Bode Cordier, the one that we looked at earlier that was in the shape of a heart. So there's a lot of exploration into how to stylize these things and how to really represent the music and kind of represent the performance. But again, there isn't really a good representation of what the tempo should be, how fast should you be performing this. And it wasn't until about 1496 there was a music theorist that suggested that we should standardize this to the beat, to the beating of a human heart who's breathing at a normal rate, which is a little bit better, but hardly a standardized metric. So obviously there are some problems with duration and tempo in early music. Before the 12th century, of course, there was a lack of rhythmic notation almost altogether. Before the 15th century, anything that was notated duration-wise was always relative to everything else in that piece. And if you don't have a base point to work off of, it was very hard to, you kind of had to figure out how you thought this piece felt. But, we don't know what they thought back, hundreds of years ago. Before the 17th century, there really still wasn't any indication of tempo markings, things like andante or allegro or 90 beats per second or anything like that wasn't really around. And the 19th century, when the metronome was invented, is when we started to see, this should be 90 beats per minute or 92 or 108 or something like that. So that brings us to modern notation and beyond. We start to see this come out as the Renaissance goes into the Baroque. This is right up on top is a Bach manuscript that shows it's pretty similar to what you'd see today. And of course now we have this proliferation of music notation software that has effectively sort of frozen this last sort of innovation sort of into a much more standardized form. This is sort of like it's become the accepted practice. Back many hundreds of years ago, you might have one group of people in some location writing music in a certain way, and then, just in the next country over, it might have been a totally different style. And here, we're starting to see this as sort of how it's done, right? But even though to us it seems like this is how it's always been, innovation still continues, just as it has hundreds of years ago. For example, the Crumb. This is another one of his pieces. It's written in a spiral. So there are definitely people who are exploring how to represent this music in a way that might either tell the performer something more about what they feel about their piece and how it should be performed. And so you'll see that with Crumb. Jazz has a lot of interesting notation and interesting ways of representing the music in a physical form. So Mike Cuthbert was saying that music is slowing down, and there is some evidence of that if you kind of take his statement from a particular view. Many hundreds of years ago, you might have a piece of music that relies on the breve as kind of the standard duration note as you move through a piece, and then as the ars nova and the ars subtilior came into being, you might see the breve start to get split, and you might see more semiminims and other kind of smaller valued notes appear. And then in today's time, we see 16th notes. The Crumb had some 64th notes and 32nd notes. And so in a sense, and then on top of that, the breve is almost hardly used anymore in modern music. And so in a sense, the music is slowing down by saying that now, okay, so we're used to the quarter note and the eighth note as being the standard beat that we're relying on. It's no longer this idea of a double whole note. So I think in that sense, music is slowing down. But in the sense of how it's being performed, how it was performed, I mean, when you think about it, like the melodies would probably progress at similar speeds, similar variances.
So what did Louis Lockwood say about the metronome in Beethoven at the last forum? I wasn't there, so how did he raise? I'm sure he must have raised some issues like this about tempo. What did he say? Do you remember?
Well, he said the Beethoven was the markings or the indications on the metronome that Beethoven gave were considered far too fast by.
And so how did he explain that? Did he have is there a reason why Beethoven's metronome markings, if we try to put them into practice, they lead to performances that sound much faster than we're used to, or at least used to be used to for Beethoven? Did he talk about that, or did he?
He did.
The metronome came halfway through his career, and that he was already halfway through his career becoming deaf. And so he was acquiring this his sense of rhythm from an otherworldly source. It wasn't from hearing it acoustically. And I think he even mentioned at one point where Beethoven was either ahead or behind an ensemble he was conducting.
He said when he was conducting, he was 10 to 12 bars behind, and
yes.
just not really.
Yeah, he wasn't connected to a really live performance. And I guess out of respect, the musicians went ahead and played what they wanted.
I believe that even in that famous anecdote of the Ninth Symphony, with one of the last times he conducted, where he had to be turned around, but because he didn't know the music had stopped and the audience was applauding, so he was still conducting and they'd reached the end, which
that seems odd.
It seems odd. It seems. I mean, it just seems. We like that story because it suggests how out of touch Beethoven was with normal world processes. But at the same time, if you're conducting, you would think you would be looking at the performers, at least, and especially Beethoven, who would know what the notes are. He wouldn't have to be reading the score quite the same way a new conductor would, I think.
Well, speaking of a new conductor, or in some cases a more recent conductor, you're all too young to know the conductor Herbert von Karajan, who was the conductor brother of the Harmonic, but he was notorious for conducting ahead of the orchestra. He had just a style where he would be rhythmically ahead of them by a half bar or more, and the orchestra played perfectly together in perfect ensemble, and it was just something to behold. And I even remember a performance where he started a Brahms symphony and indicated, with a big gesture, a chord, and he was long past it when the orchestra arrived on that chord, and there was an audible gasp through the symphony hall. You couldn't believe that this really had happened in response. But I remember in that same series of concerts, he was conducting Beethoven's Third, and he was in the last movement, and he wanted the upbeat to go a little more quickly, and the orchestra took more time to do it, and he stopped, and he waited for them. It was the most incredible thing.
Well, did Louis play any excerpts of recordings that showed various? Because did he play Norrington's recordings? Where
he didn't have Norrington's. He talked about it, but
his disc wasn't working or something like that. So he had two others.
He played two different performances that showed. One of them was an early music approach, and the other was a more standard approach, and they were different by a large number of degrees of the metronome.
It was that slow movement from the ninth, right?
Yeah, which doesn't sound like a slow movement when he plays it to me. And
yeah.
I do have the Norrington set. In fact, I think I even have it downstairs, and I could go get it if you wanted to hear. But I brought it into my office because I thought, I don't think I want to use these recordings myself at home ever. I'll keep them here as a record. But when I first heard the way he began the last movement of the Ninth Symphony, It went so fast. I was just shocked, and it was shocking for most people. That's an interesting counter to what Mike says. If anything, performances of early music have been speeding up for the last half century, because when Karajan, or take one of the great German Bach conductors of the early 20th century, his name was Richter, not the pianist Sviatoslav Richter, but Karl Richter with a K. And he used to do these, not only were the tempos slow, but the performing forces were larger. The bowing was completely different. It was more in tune with romantic bowing techniques, intonation techniques, vibrato, all these things. And if you listen to a Matthew Passion by Richter, it's going to take at least half an hour more than a Matthew Passion by John Eliot Gardner or one of the other masters of Bach conducting today. And there are many. And of course they're using smaller performance ensembles generally. They're working with them on early instruments that are the kind of...
Well, the Matthew Passion that I'm most familiar with these days is the Harlem School, which is within the boundary of the early music performance. And one of the things I noticed about that performance when I first heard it is that you really become aware that the rhythm that's used, the 12/8 rhythm that structures the whole piece, is really a dance rhythm. And you are thrown into a sense of hearing that as a dance rather than as a dirge, which I think is even more powerful because, rather than just accepting it as something funereal, you realize that life goes on and there's this sense of this rhythm as a kind of heartbeat, and it just has much more meaning, layers of meaning when it's performed more quickly.
So when you look at an early music, are you actually able to? You want to go back to the Liber Usualis? Can you actually sing that line? I'm just curious.
I mean,
the first note would be A, and I can give it to you off the piano if you want it. If you're assuming we're using modern pitch, which of course isn't.
I mean,
you need to assume.
I get the general shape, and I see that.
How fast would you want to go with a notation like that? Do you have a sense of it?
Not particularly.
It's.
I'm not sure. Usually we took these rather slow when we were in 220.
Yeah, because you were sight singing, weren't you?
Well, yeah, that also.
So the first neume is an upward. Is that a G?
Where?
Is there a flat in there?
There is.
I don't have my reading glasses on.
That's a G.
Are we? Is that really what it does?
Yeah. It's the right shape.
So do you think of that as, you wouldn't want that, how fast, you don't think of that as being like...
No.
What's the next
Yeah.
one there?
No, certainly not.
So, but there's nothing in the notation that tells you that? It's
Right.
just the music? It's the tradition you're used to?
Yeah, that's like, every time that I listen to, Gregorian chant on a recording or something, it's always taken, if it's a Kyrie or something like that, it's usually taken pretty slow. And so that's just what we're used to, though. But no one's, there's, as far as I know, there's no primary sources from that era that say, oh, you should sing it this fast, or.
What about?
That's one of the ways in which Lockwood, I think, framed the debate. He said there's a debate between performing out of the experience of performing,
right,
and within space, and how something looks on paper,
right,
or put it between the written interpretation,
right,
and the experience. And I think he said that each of them is equally valid. It's not something. It's just the choice that one has to make. And of course, most of the Gregorian chant that we hear chant of any kind, is performed in a resonant space. And so that will tell us something about how to do it if we want to hear clearly
Right.
how this moves.
The individual notes and
Right.
yeah.
Right. Well, and I wanted to go back to the Chopin because there was a very interesting book of music theory or music analysis by a brilliant theorist at Princeton named Edward T. Cohn. And it's a short book. It's called Musical Form and Musical Performance. And it tries to explain issues that how you connect analysis of music to performance of music and how difficult that is. But his argument is ultimately a performance of a piece, a considered performance of a piece, is an analysis. That the best performers, in some level or another, are analyzing the music and they're communicating their analysis through the way they play.
Perform.
But he looks at a piece like this, which looks so simple and so clear in terms of modern notation, and he talks about many issues that are, and some of them are issues of tempo, but many of them have to do with how do you respect Chopin's notation. And one of the places, for example, and again, I'm not good at this because I haven't been playing, but are you going to do that first dotted note on the downbeat literally? Wait a minute, it's a C, right?
Yeah, it's
So are you going to count it as 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1? Or are you going to inflect it? Are you going to soften it? And if you're going to use the rubato, where are you going to use it and where are you going to pick it up? And for me, the hard part is that climactic phrase in the second line, the second half of the piece where it starts over. Is it and then, I can't, my eyes are, and you have to do this wide chord, right? And I always want to slow down there because I can't stretch it. And there's a crescendo, but there's nothing in the score that indicates that. But it is the climax. It goes to an accent, da 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 dee dee dee, and then he puts a little apostrophe in. It seems, indicating to take a Luftpause or an air breath. So even the simplicity of a notation like that, let alone what andantino means. What does andantino mean to you? Or to you, Judy? Do you have a feeling of that tempo marking?
It's kind of a.
What does andante mean? Do you know?
Walking.
Walking?
Yeah.
Going? It literally means going. So andantino is that means less. It's a diminutive.
Slower, yeah.
Does that mean faster or slower than walking?
Less.
What does it mean, Margaret?
Good question. It probably means quicker than.
Slightly quicker than andante.
Right.
That's a guess.
What I was thinking is I should open up my laptop and download 3 performances of this, and we should listen to them. But you could do that on your own, and I guarantee you all the Chopin masters of the waltz, the masters of Chopin's waltzes like Rubinstein and Lipati, and well, there's so many, Cortot and all, they'll all do this very differently.
Yeah.
So it's, but the idea that the quarter note is the beat is the issue that you're raising.
I'm saying from a notational standpoint.
And that would be what, according to the old tradition? What is a quarter note?
I mean, it depends on how far back you go, because
you got from.
So for a while it was like the brev was, that sort of standard. Like here you see in the square notation. I guess I shouldn't really use this, but you have the brevs and minims, right, as the sort of, that's kind of what it's all written as, and that's kind of the standard.
Square notes, and with the point here is that the stems don't have anything to do with their duration.
Right.
they indicate groupings
Yeah.
of notes. So you use a stem before, or in the case of the first two neumes, you have a stem to the left and another stem to the left, which indicates that each of those pairs of notes are a single neume.
Right.
But does that, and then you have a stem to the right when you get to the high note on the vowel E, followed by two little diamonds, and that's another neume formation indicating three notes in a row that are clustered together. But it doesn't tell us anything about duration, whereas
Right.
later stems came to me, as you pointed out.
Well, oops, not that one, this one.
The adding what happens when you added?
Let me
You have-
move to, no, sorry, let me move back to, this is when you start seeing stems
Well, now when
representing
you added
notation.
a stem to the diamond, does it make it a longer note or a shorter?
It's
note?
shorter.
Yes.
And then they started having stems with curls in them, going in different directions, and
Right. So you called those minims, and then they became
semi-minims.
semi-minims. And now we're up to semi-hemi-demi minims.
Yeah, something
or
like that.
hemi-demi semi-minims, or quavers as the English call it.
Right.
So we have different traditions. But any comments here about your experience in notation? How did you learn to feel pulses and notations and so forth when you were learning violin?
Rhythm-wise?
Yeah.
Well, I feel like a lot of the time, at least when I began playing a piece, my music teacher would tell me, everyone would start slow, but as I increase it up to a certain pace, I would notice that sometimes when I'm actually practicing, I would be slower than when I perform. So I guess sort of when I was learning to develop maybe a feeling, my teacher gave me sort of the freedom to have a little bit of variation of with the pace of the song I would have, but she would always tell me keep in mind that when you're performing you tend to be a little faster. So for me learning at least for faster paced songs, I would slow myself down so that when I perform I hit it.
What's one of the fastest pieces you ever had to perform?
Trying to think.
Concertos? Did you do violin
Yeah.
concerto movements? Vivaldi or some people like the Mozart or?
Mozart was one. I thought the Lala was one of the best.
Which piece? The Symphony Española?
Yeah.
And when you got to a place, did you feel like this is the right tempo? Or did you ever feel that it could go faster, that you just weren't
I
able?
wanted to play it faster, which was, and the thing is, it's actually, in the beginning, it's not supposed to be that fast. The cadenza part, I feel like I would always rush it more than I should be playing it. So, but yeah, I guess I gradually developed a sense of speed where it's not just for me to be comfortable playing it, but also having someone sit there and listen and be I don't feel like I'm having a heart attack while I'm listening to it.
What do you remember about Mark's presentation yesterday about the sense of time and speed? Do you remember what happened when he played one of the pieces? He asked us how long it was.
Yeah.
You
What do you remember about
kind of
it?
get lost in it, and everyone said it was longer than it really was.
Mark played us an excerpt of one of his own pieces that went on for a while, and then he faded it out very slowly. And he said, "How long do you think it is?" Some people said 6 or 7 minutes. One person said 4, and I said 5. It was 2 1/4. But it was a very floating kind of music without any recognizable regular pulse. So it was free of time, and that was part of his argument, that it was trying to get free of time and create a sense of openness. And it was, I really wanted him to prove that, because I didn't believe it, but we moved on.
Yeah, it did seem like a long time though.
But he swore that it was 2
2 minutes,
and
10 seconds.
anyways, all right. So Carol, we've been talking. You missed some of the presentation. Do Do you remember anything? Oh, what do you remember about Libby Larson talking about tempo in one of her pieces? Do you remember that moment at the forum when she talked about the beginning of one of her pieces? Does anybody remember that? What she said about Marcus? You can remind me probably.
Well, I can certainly remind them because she said that she conceived the one movement as being very slow. And she started singing an example of it. And I remember that those of us who play this looked at one another and said, oh my God, this is a lot slower than we were thinking of it. Even though she was very clear in the way she marked the connection with marking. And so we said, well, let's try playing it that way. And it's true that it had the kind of spaciousness that she wanted, but it also created a certain kind of tension. So we ended up gradually creeping back to the tempo that we had been more used to. And I think that's almost true of any ensemble. Any group of people will arrive at the truth of the tempo better than any, that will be different from any one person's opinion. So,
Even the composer.
Even the composers, yeah.
Stravinsky was very careful as he reissued all of his scores later in life to mark them all with tempos, metronome marking tempos. But if you listen to his conducting, he often does not hear them. At least certainly not consistently. Other scores that we didn't look at today, but if you look at modern notations, Bartók always puts a time at the end of his pieces, and they're always down to a second. So even in his short piano pieces that are in his Microcosmos anthology for piano students, he'll write at the end 17 seconds, 14 seconds. But he does sometimes say that he doesn't expect these to be more than guidelines. And other composers will write these fantastically complex notations like Milton Babbitt or Boulez and others, where they've subdivided beats into ridiculously varied numbers, irrational numbers, and they have multiple irrational numbers competing with each other, so that one part is dividing into sevens while another is dividing into fives, while another is unbarred and unbeaten, and you have this strange, the effect is a little bit like what Mark was getting through his improvisational performance. Where are we in time? I don't have...
It's 1:50.
Okay.
Can I read something I just found here? When we were talking, this goes back to what when you were mentioning Edward Cohn as the book he uses. I know that we have a quote from him in our syllabus for 21M.542. That's advanced music performance, and he makes a point which in this paragraph was very much what you were saying about how a good performance is analysis in some way. So this is the actual quote from Edward Cohn. It is therefore often helpful to supplement them, that is, words used for analysis, with another set of terms, less technical perhaps, more firmly bound to concepts of time. Preparation, adumbration, arrival, departure, return, dissolution, echo, reminiscence, and so on. So a person who is interpreting a piece of music would think of the phrase that they're looking at as to whether or not it's a preparation or it's an adumbration, an arrival, a departure, a return, an echo. And then he goes on to say, it may be argued that these belong to the domain of expression rather than form, but can one make that dichotomy? Can form and expression be separated? I do not believe they can. Musical form itself is expressive.
Right, and he analyzes that prelude in terms of where is the climax and how do you shape the performance to reach the climax. He also uses modern approaches which talk not about the rhythms or the beats as the rhythms, but phrases as rhythms, and phrases as upbeats and downbeats themselves. So that is dum ba da dum bum bum. Is that an upbeat phrase or a downbeat phrase? I used it as an upbeat for dum ba da dum bum bum ba da da dum bum bum ba da dum bum 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 ba da dum But then how am I going to shape the next part to make a climate? I don't know. You can conceptualize it that way, that each phrase is part of an upbeat or a downbeat process. And part of what makes that especially useful to 19th century music is that, as another analyst theorist wrote, people like Schumann and Mendelssohn and other mid-romantic composers tended to use four-measure phrases as one measure. They become hypermeasures. They write in hypermeasures, so that each measure is a beat. And in a sense, that goes back to some pieces by Beethoven, where you go and you're not really counting beats and bars. You're counting bars as beats. 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 6 to 4. So you tend to group the bars into phrases of into measures, and then the groups of hypermeasures become phrases, and pretty soon the whole piece becomes one big upbeat or one big downbeat. You keep abstracting to a higher and higher level of rhythm and time, and I think that's part of it. Getting at the idea of adumbration, foreshadowing, arrival, repetition, emphasis, and climax. But these are, in some ways, they are spatial terms, but they're also temporal terms.
Can I just say a word about the earlier neumes that you showed? I'm not an expert in early music, as is Michael and the others. But it seems to me that that earlier notation was, as you say, a kind of shorthand for an oral tradition. And so for our class, we all know, how Happy Birthday goes, but just in case, you just write a little squiggle, for where it goes up and goes down, and we'll know how to start it and get it going. And we'll know that as a group over a long period of time, but the group that's 20 years from now that didn't hear it sung in the first way won't have the benefit of knowing what it was like when that notation was created. They'll only know the shorthand for how to get started and know the version that is immediately within their lifetime, And so, of course, the notation becomes to add a sense of rhythm and a sense of time, or how quickly it goes. I guess the benefit of the more complete notation, but even the most complete notation doesn't.
I mean, I don't know exactly where this comes from, but I remember hearing that, like students of music during the sort of early history of music, when it was only after they had mastered the material that their teacher would give them the textbook or the book of the music, so that it really was just an oral tradition for a very long time.
For singers.
For singers, and I mean, I guess early instrumentalists as well.
Sure.
But I think now the way that the notation is done now, I think, if there was some other 600 years from now or something, if they were looking back on this without any knowledge of what this was, I think it'd be easier for them to figure out like the music from the last couple hundred years, as opposed to us trying to figure out the music from 1200 or 1300.
It would be comparatively easier than the time we had trying to figure out Greek music, for instance. I remember when I was in graduate school, they somehow found the Rosetta Stone for. Do you remember that, Marty?
They found some parchments or something.
Yeah, they figured out how to interpret Greek music, and I remember someone came to class and started playing a common tune that everyone would know, or everyone at the time would have known, but they had 6 or 8 different possible tunings for it. So even though you had the general contours, you couldn't tell exactly what the pictures were, because there were very particular treatises on how you tune the notes in relation to one another, and of course there's nothing about rhythm. So
right.
Well, of course, it's all different now.
Yeah.
Everything is preserved through media.
Yeah.
And with recordings and with videos,
Right.
we have archival records. And then the question becomes again, I guess, sort of what Lewis Lockwood was talking about. Do you want to position yourself as being continuous in a tradition of performance? Do you want to reduplicate what other people have established as an approach? Or do you want to challenge that, like Norrington? And Norrington says in the case of Beethoven's symphonies, I'm going to use Beethoven's metronome march. But the fact is, Norrington or Harnoncourt or other early music conductors will often do the same thing, where there is no metronome marching. They will challenge the established tempos of many recordings that have been preserved across the 20th century. They'll go faster or they'll go slower. And I can always remember the first time I heard a fairly recent recording by Harnoncourt he now conducts something called the Orchestra of the 18th Century or the Orchestra of the Enlightenment,
Right.
one of those groups. And his version of Mozart's 40th, was not only really fast, but it was savagely fast. He was making all the downbeats accented, and he was bringing out the dissonances in a way that was almost harsh to the ear. I was really shocked when I heard it, because he was trying to find a way to revitalize our hearing of that piece, to make it, quote, fresh or new. And in that case, part of it was to go fast. But I'm sure there are others. For example, one of the most famous Tristan in his oldest on record was a live performance that Leonard Bernstein conducted in Vienna in the 70s, I think, which is on 5 discs rather than 3 or 4. Not only because he wanted the breaks to be at the right places. He didn't want to have breaks in the middle of something, but also because he goes so slowly at some points that he makes you yearn. You watch Malcolm in the Middle?
Yeah.
Did you watch him? Do you remember the asthmatic kid, the kid in the wheelchair who was asthmatic? The joke, the humor of his character is that when he talks, he has to take a breath between every word, and sometimes he's going to say the obvious thing, but you have to wait for it. But other times, because of the breath, he manages. You're waiting for what you expect, and then he says something else. You're waiting for every molecule. You know, and say something like that, and you kind of don't know what he's talking about. That's what Bernstein did. I mean, it's only part of it, but the tempo was so slow. So we can't know anymore what people are going to do with musical records 300 years from now. How are they going to interpret? Because there's so much that survives. It's my advisor at Harvard. My history advisor, my PhD advisor used to say, it's much better if things disappear, if they don't survive, because we're going to be overwhelmed by things. Historians from 500 years from now, how are they ever going to go through all the documents?
It's that information overload, right?
The information overload and processing overload.
We're certainly...
So, tempo issues, it'll be fascinating.
Well, I mean, we're certainly doing better. I mean, we're not in that stage where we're burning books or using manuscript as book covers and.
Right.
You know,
but I've noticed a tendency in popular music when people do covers. I don't hear a lot of variation in tempo or rhythm. I hear variations in the instrumentation or the singing style, the articulation. Harmonies get changed, but if you're doing Elvis Presley's songs or Sting is doing Sting's doing Sting with John Allen, but if people are doing Sting's songs, I don't hear a wide change. Does anybody? I mean, do you know of a performance or pieces that you like to listen to in popular music that has been widely changed through a different performance? There's a commercial now using "All You Need Is Love" by the Beatles.
Well, that's
I
a
can't remember
cover.
what it's for.
It's for T-Mobile or it's some cell phone company.
But even though it sounds completely different from the Beatles, I don't think it's much different in all you need is love. Because we have that sound in our head from hearing it.
I mean, part of it is so that it's recognizable to the listener.
It's like Happy Birthday.
And then for cover bands, I mean, part of how a lot of people evaluate how good a cover band is how good are they at replicating the sound of whoever they're covering.
Right, you're expected to be able to sound like the band you're
Right.
imitating. So you have to do it the way they do.
So I mean, I kind of see both extremes. There's many cover bands try to do exactly the same thing, and then there are others that purposefully change it so much that you really have to think about it. Like there's I forget who. There's some popular musician who does like acoustic guitar covers of like hardcore rap songs and stuff, and it's funny because of that huge shift, and it's done intentionally. But I don't think there's very much of that middle ground where, I don't know if you guys, I don't really listen to the radio anymore.
Or somebody trying to play the Tchaikovsky symphony on early instruments.
If it's into that,
That's also
it would sound very strange. to me, it would sound very strange. I don't know. I can't. I don't have any answers here, but I think these are the issues. These are the questions that keep coming up. Maybe we should stop for today.